Thank you, Christy. If you've ever read a biography, they tend to start small, about where the person was born, the way that they grew up, who their parents were, what child was like for them. But when we open up the biography that John writes of Jesus, John does not start that way. John starts big. He takes us back to the beginning, before there was a planet, before there were stars hung in the sky, before time starts ticking. And he kind of starts off by saying, let me tell you who Jesus is. This is John's purpose for writing his letter, his gospel. And we talked about that a little bit last week. We went to the end of his gospel in chapter 20 to talk about the purpose for him writing about Jesus, so that people would believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And now, as we go through our series, we're going to go back to the beginning and look at how purposefully John wrote about all of that Jesus did so that we would understand that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. I should have mentioned this last week, but John is best friends with Jesus. And I think this is a unique perspective because we have the book of Matthew written about Jesus. Matthew is a dedicated disciple. Mark and Luke, they write their gospels with eyewitness accounts, and they're gathering information about Jesus from others. But John was the one that laid his head on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. John is the one that was there for Jesus' last breath. John loves Jesus deeply, as best friends do. This was the relationship that John had with Jesus, and he was very close. And so when John writes, he's writing of a good friend, a best friend, one that he laughed with and cried with and ate with. And John has some deep theology contained there, but he's writing about his friend. And so when we start this gospel, John chapter 1, we're going to see John is really writing in three parts, or we're going to split it up into three parts to understand it a little bit more. This prologue that most people call John chapter 1, verse 1 through 18. In these three sections, we're going to look at the claim that John makes of Jesus, the reaction to the claim, and then the answer to that reaction. So let's open up, and we're going to read straight through all 18 verses here to kick off. So John chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life. And that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness. The darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone is coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, 'This is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.' Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. John just made a radical claim, a huge claim, that the one that made everything and created entered that creation. There's a lot to this claim and this concept. And man, I encourage you to look more into this passage. If you're someone that likes to dive into the certain words of things, I really encourage you. There's so many great podcasts and videos out there of just this section of John because it's just such rich with depth. We're just going to look at a few aspects of it this morning. One is this word. In the beginning was the Word. What is the Word? What does John mean by word? It's filled with meaning. It's the soaking wet Greek word. It came from Greek philosophy. And in Greek philosophy, they're developing this thought. There had to be something in the universe that brought all of this together. Because as they observed things just worked out. Like when the sun went down, the moon came up, and animals live together in harmony, and they have everything has something to eat, and that thing that is eaten has other things to eat, and like it just works out. What is this? And they called this concept logos, Logos, and that's where we get our English. This is the word that John is using here. And in Greek thought, this is it's almost like the Force of Star Wars, right? This thing that just is out there that's making things work. You have Aristotle. Aristotle came 300 years before Jesus, and Aristotle took this concept and went a little bit further with it in his philosophy and would say not only is it the thing behind the universe that makes it work, but it's also the force that determines right from wrong. It informs morals on humanity. And so it's not just the order of the world, it's informing the world. It's this mysterious, vague idea that helps us understand. And John is saying this mysterious entity that floats and brings morals is actually a person that put on flesh. And there's nothing mysterious about it. The Logos is Jesus. This is the claim that John is making to his Greek audience. That these philosophies of vague force in the world beyond is real and is present, and he walked with us. So to the Greeks, logos meant this rational force behind a reality. But John is also speaking to the Jews. And to the Jews, the word had great meaning too. I mean, think of the Old Testament. God spoke creation into being. God's words were powerful. God sent messengers to proclaim his word. Thus saith the Lord. Words had intentionality and purpose. And God spoke promises. God spoke salvation, and history moved forward. And so here's the claim that John is making. The claim is this: in Jesus, God came near. God is near to us in Jesus. In this word, logos, that became flesh. And that God did not relegate himself to a distance. He didn't stay on top of a mountain just simply giving us commands from there, but he came to us. He reached out to us and became one of us. Verse 14 clarifies exactly what John means by the Word. The Word became flesh. He says this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word is the Son, Jesus, who came to dwell among us. God came near to us through Jesus. Maybe Eugene Peterson's paraphrase translation called The Message would help us. This is what he says in John 1:14. He says, the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. God showed up. God moved in. He moved into the neighborhood. And this is not just John's own claim. John is going to go on to record Jesus claiming that he forgives sins, claiming that the miracles are pointing to his divine nature, that he can raise a man from the dead. He'll heal from a distance. He won't even have to touch the person. He will claim to be the way, the truth, and the life. This is going to be the way Jesus lives. This is going to be the way Jesus conducts himself and talks about himself. He is God in the flesh. There's a book written called A Brief History of Thought. And it's written by a French atheist philosopher himself, just talking about the history of philosophies and thoughts. And so he's writing this book, and in this book he comes to this idea logos. And this is what he says about it. The logos for the Greeks was the impersonal, harmonious, divine structure of the cosmos as a whole. But to the horror of the Greeks, the Christians maintain that the Logos was not the harmonious order of the world, but was a singular, unique personality, one outstanding individual, namely Christ. And so he's saying a little bit what I've already said this morning. This is a brand new thought for the world, that the Logos of the world, this vague force, isn't vague, it is personal. But then this French atheist, Luc Ferry, as he writes his book, goes on to evaluate this a little bit. And here's another quote from his book. He says, by resting its case on the definition of the human person and an unprecedented idea of love, Christianity had an incalculable effect on the history of ideas. To give just one example, it is quite clear without this Christian reevaluation of the human person, the philosophy of human rights, which we subscribe to today, would never have established itself. And so what he's saying is this idea that it's not just vague anymore, but it's actually a person in Jesus Christ. And then what Jesus Christ went on to do completely changed the world. And he said, I'll give you one example of that. The idea that we have human rights, that everybody is equal and has divine rights, that's completely different than the world's thoughts. That's uniquely Christian. Christians brought this into the world. Do you see what he's saying? We have this universal belief that because of the unique Christ being flesh and blood in this world, the world changed. Now, I don't think John had all of this in mind when he was writing. He was just getting his readers to understand the answer to the question, who is Jesus? He is God come near. He is divine. He is the Word since the beginning. That's the claim. But here's the tragedy. John goes on to write, when God came near, most rejected him. That's what John goes on to talk about in his next section here as he talks about darkness and light, and we're going to spend an entire week on this, and so I'm going to fall short of completely explaining it this morning, but Jesus was light come into the darkness, and the darkness rejected it. Darkness didn't know what to do with it. And he talks about John, and this isn't John, the author, John writing about himself. This is John the Baptist that he writes about here in chapter 1, that John came to warn us of the light, to give us a heads up, to tell people to repent, that Jesus was coming, and there's even prophecies about John coming. But people didn't listen. There's rejection of him. There's rejection of Jesus, the light. There's a widespread rejection. And you may have lived through something like this, understanding what John is talking about here with the light and the darkness. You're watching a movie, and so the lights in the house have been dimmed, and then the movie's over, and the credits start to roll, and someone gets up and says, finally, I have to go to the bathroom so bad, and they get up, and they go, okay, I'm going to turn on the lights now. They give you a warning. But inevitably what happens, they turn on the lights, and everybody goes, oh, not because you were so accustomed to the dark. Your eyes had adjusted to the light, or to the darkness. And so then light comes on, and it's drastic. It's a drastic change. And this is what John is saying happened in the world. They're so accustomed to the way things were going. They're accustomed to their sin. They're accustomed to their life. And so all of a sudden, Someone comes and says, no, life is about to change. No, what you understand about God is different and it's to change radically. And people go, I don't know if I can handle that. And darkness couldn't overcome it, but it could hide from it. And they did. They rejected the light. It also talks about how they didn't understand it. He was sent to his own, but his own did not receive him. They didn't know what to do with Jesus. They didn't know what to do with a God come close, but yet he would eat with sinners and prostitutes and tax collectors. They didn't know what to do with God come near, but yet he would heal on the Sabbath. They thought they were supposed to respect that. They just didn't know what to do with him. Imagine a master architect designs this massive building. Years later, it's still being under construction. And so he shows up to the construction site and the workers start to argue about how the building is supposed to be constructed and how it's supposed to work. That's humanity with Jesus. The designer shows up and we say, no, we think we know better. We think we know how it's supposed to work. We think we can redefine life, identity, truth, when the architect is standing right in front of us. So here's the rejection of the claim. I think two things that John is trying to show us. One is that darkness just doesn't like light, and the other one is that there's confusion about the light. There's a flat-out rejection of the light. It doesn't like light. It doesn't know how to live with this light. The confusion about the light. The overall impact from people around Jesus was rejection. And darkness doesn't just mean sin, though it's definitely sin. It also means the lies that we believe, the shame that we hide, the injustice that we see, the addictions that we can't break, the guilt we carry, all these systems in the world and the things that we're caught up in that reject God. All of this is the darkness of the world that we live in. And so when the light comes and when Jesus came and he says, hey, we can live with God, and Jesus shows up and he says, okay, I want to expose the lies. I want to confront shame with grace. I want to defeat guilt with forgiveness. I want to interrupt the hatred of the world with love. Light and darkness can't coexist. And light wins, but often darkness tries to hold on to that darkness. And so it retreats. Looking at Jesus' life, it almost looks like darkness won. I mean, he went to the cross, he died, right? But as loud as darkness can be and as overwhelming as darkness can be, it loses every time. And Jesus' resurrection shows us this. John continues on to the third section, which I should say, like, these sections are just how I'm sectioning this off. I don't think this is how John intended to section this off, but just as we're trying to wrap our minds around it. And in this third section, it starts off with verse 12, and I think this is like the pinnacle of this section. This is what verse 12 says. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. The reason I'm calling this the answer to the rejection is because it's still presented by John as good news. That's what the word gospel means, good news. The answer is light won. This still happened. Jesus still came. Just because there's going to be rejection didn't mean God withheld Jesus, withheld himself from us. And because of that, all who receive him, all who believe in his name, have the right to become children of God. And I might say, well, aren't we all children of God? Aren't we all created by God? And in that sense, I would say, yes, we're all God's children, and that God created all of us. But in another sense, one that I think the Bible uses more often, for those that respond to God and draw near to God, those are the children of God. Those are the ones that have responded to his message, to the gospel, which is the good news. Turn their lives to God, their attention to God. And so here's how I would say the answer to the rejection that John gives us. The answer to the rejection is the gospel, which is the good news. The other part is God with flesh. and God among us. And we're going to see how John talks about that here in the end of this passage. The answer to this rejection is that Jesus came from heaven. He lived a perfect life that we could not. He died a death that we deserved. He was resurrected by the Spirit that still lives in us today. And this is the gospel. This is John's emphasis through his gospel that he writes, the recording of Jesus' life, the good news that God sent Jesus for us. And when you believe this, you become a child of God. And not by natural heritage, but by adoption. He brings us into his family. And that God became flesh. I want to look again at verse 14. It says, the Word became flesh and dwelled and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. We could spend so many hours just trying to understand this and capture this, that God put on flesh in human form, that Jesus was 100% divine and 100% human. And how that works out, I don't fully understand. But this is what John presents to us, that God became flesh and made his dwelling among us in Jesus. And so John wants us to know through his stories that the baby was the man in Galilee that plays with and eats with real human blood. And he was the creator of the universe. John wants us to know that there was a man that laughed so hard that the Jewish establishment thought he was drunk. That Jesus was the man that wept at a grave of a friend, but he's also the one that defeated the grave. John wants us to know that Jesus, that though he got so tired and thirsty, asking a Samaritan woman for a drink, is the one that made the hydrogen and oxygen atoms to begin with. That Caesar, though he thought he ruled the world, yet there's one who put the galaxies in space laying in a cattle trough, unable to speak. That's the God that put on flesh. And God with us. This is another part of verse 14 here, that God would be with us. It says, God made his dwelling among us. And this word dwelling literally just means big tent. God made a big tent among us. That doesn't make sense. You need to understand, John is pulling us once again back to the Old Testament. God made his tabernacle among us. This tabernacle is from the book of Exodus. When God first led his people out of Egypt, God said, I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to guide you. And he instructed them to make a big tent, a tabernacle, where his presence could be among his people. And when they moved to a new place, they would pack up the tent and move and then unpack, and then God would remain with his people in this place. This is the imagery that John is using with us once again, that God is tabernacling among his people. This time not in a literal tent like it was in the Old Testament, but this time with flesh and bone through Jesus Christ. He is dwelling among us. And it's not only the Israelites that would have a place of worship like a tabernacle. There were temples and synagogues, and every religion has their structure by which they understand they're to go to worship their God. And this is partly because I believe all of us have this understanding that between God, there's a great divide. And so we need to create some place of worship, some place where that divide is a little bit thinner, where we can worship or sacrifice, whatever it might be, so that we can get closer to the divine. And so there's an old preacher story that imagines first century Christian talking to their Roman neighbor. And their Roman neighbor says, hey, I heard you've become a Christian. Tell me about that. Where do you go to your temple? The Christian says, I don't need a temple. I have Jesus. Jesus is my temple. Roman's unsure of that. And Roman says, okay, but where do your priests go to operate? I don't need a priest. Jesus is my high priest. Okay, but who offers your sacrifices to please your God? I don't need to offer sacrifices anymore. Jesus is my sacrifice, and he is pleasing to God. Okay, sure. That doesn't sound like any religion I've ever heard of. This is no religion at all. To which the Roman neighbor is exactly right. It is not a religion. It is the right to become a child of God. This is what Jesus has done for us. When he put on flesh and he tabernacled among us and he became one of us, to live a life we could never live, to die a death that we deserved, to be resurrected by the Spirit that still lives in us. And to wrap up, I want to reread verse 18, how John ends this section. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, and has made him known. If you want to know what or who God is, we are to look at Jesus. If you want to know how God would treat people, you look at Jesus. If you want to know what God would think of those that are far from him, you look at Jesus and see how Jesus treated them. If you want to know what God thinks of the hurt and the suffering, you look at Jesus and how Jesus treated them. John tells us that the world mostly missed God because they rejected Jesus. The Creator walked among the creation and they rejected it. They didn't recognize him. They didn't understand him. But John tells us something incredible. To all that do recognize Jesus and all that do believe in Jesus, they have the right to become children of God. And this is not just an improved people. This is not just a people that say, okay, now I get to add something to life. I had church on a Sunday morning. Maybe I had a small group on another night of the week, and I add some prayer and some Bible study. This is not a people that now are on a certain list and other people aren't. This is a people that are brand new. This is a new creation. This is a new people, and these are God's children so that you could truly live. We have a God who reached out so that we could come near and become his children. Let's pray. God, we are so thankful to be called your children. We are so thankful that is our identity. There might be other smaller identities that we wear, other responsibilities in life, other ways we would describe ourselves, but there's no greater identity, there's no greater description for who we are than your children. That is the greatest thing we could ever live for. And so God, I pray just as we opened up just 18 verses and we see how radically different we are to live and how radically different our lives can be because of your Son, that we would respond to that. And we would understand what that means for the world around us. And so God, I pray and just thank you for that reality. I thank you that you did not stay on a mountain, that you did not stay far from us, but you came near through your Son. And through his life, we see how life can be lived and how he gave us life to live. And so God, we just pray that we would draw near to you, that we would live in the greatest identity that we can live as your children. And maybe that means everything else needs to be stripped away this morning. God, just as I think of a conversation that happened earlier, just immediately before service, there's so many other things we try to live up to, and we fail at them, and so we think we're failing at this relationship with you too, God, and it's just not true. And so this relationship isn't up to us. It's not up to us living a certain standard or doing it a certain way or seeing how it's done online and maybe the person next to us, and so we need to be as good as they are. God, it's about how good your Son was. And so I just pray that that penetrates our heart this morning. And we truly live and understand the depths of what it means to be your child. I pray all of this in your Son's name. Amen.